For 300,000 years, they ruled a world that would have killed most things alive today. They were not the brutish cavemen of old textbooks. They were hunters, caregivers, symbol makers, a people with culture, with memory, with a survival system so deeply engineered that by every reasonable biological metric, it should have lasted forever. And then it didn't. What ended them was not a war. It was not a plague. It was something so quiet and so structural that science spent nearly a century asking entirely the wrong questions about it. And the right question, the one that finally cracked this open, was not about the species in general. It was about the women specifically. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now and tell me where in the world you are watching this. City, country, continent, whatever you want. I read every single one. That question about the women is where this story ends up. But to understand what the answer actually means, you first have to understand what kind of system they were holding together. For 300,000 years, Neanderthals ran one of the most sophisticated survival architectures this planet has ever produced. They were not the shambling brutes of old museum dioramas. They were engineers of endurance hunters who closed distance on bison at full charge with thrusting spears, who tracked prey across hundreds of kilometers of frozen terrain, who buried their dead with deliberate intention and adorned their bodies with eagle talons and ochre and feathers that had to be sourced, prepared, and chosen. They carved symbols into cave walls. They maintained long-term care for injured and elderly members of their groups across years of recovery that demanded planning, emotional investment, and social memory. Every one of those behaviors points to the same thing: a species operating not on instinct alone, but on networked intelligence. A people with culture, with continuity, with the kind of internal social connectivity that allows a group to persist across generations, even when individual losses are severe. By any reasonable biological metric, the Neanderthal survival system should have been durable enough to outlast almost anything this planet threw at it. It had already lasted 300,000 years. It had already survived ice ages, volcanic winters, and the slow, grinding pressure of a world that never once made survival easy. And then something went wrong. Not suddenly, not violently, quietly, structurally. At a level so deep inside the system that by the time it became visible in the fossil record, it had already been operating for generations. What failed was not their strength. What failed was something far more fundamental, and the key to understanding it was hidden inside the women. For decades, scientists made an assumption about Neanderthal social structure that felt reasonable because it mirrored assumptions researchers had already imposed on early human societies. Males hunted, females gathered, cared for young, remained close to camp. A clean division of labor that made the ancient world feel legible. The problem is that the bones never agreed with that story. Neanderthal women were not physically marginal. They were built for a world that demanded full participation from every member of the group. Female Neanderthal skeletons show dense bone architecture, heavily developed muscle attachment points, and a physical frame engineered for sustained, high-intensity labor. The muscle markings found on female remains are comparable in many cases to those found on modern male athletes. These were not bystanders in a dangerous world. These were load-bearing members of a survival system that could not afford passengers. And then there are the fractures. The healed injuries found on female Neanderthal remains cluster in a pattern that researchers found impossible to ignore, concentrated on the head, neck, and upper body. When you map that injury signature onto modern populations, one group matches with striking consistency: rodeo riders. People who make their living in close, volatile, physical contact with large, unpredictable animals. Neanderthal women were not observing the hunt from a distance. They were inside it. But here is the thing. Bones can tell us about bodies and hint at behavior. What they cannot tell us is how the social system that organized those bodies actually functioned. They cannot tell us where these women came from, who they were in relation to each other, or how that system was already beginning to fracture from within. For that, you need the DNA. And when scientists finally got it, the picture that emerged was not what anyone had been prepared for. Deep in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, there is a cave that has been sitting quietly at the center of one of the most important scientific discoveries in the history of human origins research. It is called Chagyrskaya Cave, and what came out of it restructured what we thought we knew about how Neanderthals built and maintained their social systems. Excavations at Chagyrskaya have been ongoing for years, but the scale and quality of what researchers recovered there elevated the site into a category of its own. Scientists found the remains of at least 13 individual Neanderthals. That number alone is remarkable. But what made the discovery genuinely unprecedented was the temporal window those individuals represented. Analysis of the remains indicated that these people had not accumulated in the cave across thousands of years, as is standard at most fossil sites. They had lived within the same narrow slice of time, possibly the same generation, possibly people who had sat around the same fire, who had known each other's faces. For the first time in the history of paleoanthropology, researchers were not looking at scattered fragments of a species distributed across millennia. They were looking at something that functioned like a snapshot of an actual population node, a single community preserved at a single moment in time. Ancient DNA was extracted from multiple individuals, including several females, with preservation quality exceptional enough to yield clean, reliable genetic data from people who lived approximately 54,000 years ago. The findings were published in 2022 Inches, the journal Nature, and were immediately understood to be among the most significant contributions to Neanderthal science in a generation. But the real significance was not in what the data confirmed. It was in what the data revealed that no one had been looking for a hidden fracture running directly through the center of the social system, and it pointed straight at the women. When scientists began working through the genetic data from Chagyrskaya Cave, the first thing that stood out was not a dramatic positive discovery. It was an absence. A quiet, structural, deeply telling absence of genetic diversity, the kind of absence that, in population biology, is not merely a curiosity but a warning signal about the long-term viability of an entire network. Genetic diversity is not just a measure of biological variation. It is the primary resilience buffer of a population system. The more variation within a gene pool, the more adaptive flexibility a group retains in the face of disease, environmental stress, or demographic loss. Modern human communities, even historically isolated ones, maintain a baseline level of diversity that reflects thousands of years of movement, mixing, and intergroup connectivity. That connectivity is not accidental. It is one of the core operational features of our species' survival architecture. The Chagyrskaya Neanderthals had almost none of it. When researchers calculated the effective population size implied by the genetic data, the number was staggering in its smallness. The estimated breeding population of this community fell somewhere between 10 and 20 individuals, not 10 to 20 people present at a given moment, but 10 to 20 individuals contributing genetic material to the pool across generations. For a species capable of ranging hundreds of kilometers across a continent, that figure represents a population connectivity system operating in a state of near-total collapse. To calibrate that number, some of the most geographically remote and historically isolated human populations ever studied still showed dramatically higher genetic variation than what was found here. The Chagyrskaya community was not simply small. It was functioning at the absolute outer edge of what population genetics considers demographically viable, the point where a single bad season, a single outbreak, a single loss of reproductive capacity becomes not a setback, but a termination event. And that raised the question that researchers had to answer. How had this system been sustaining itself at all? The answer was in the data. But to find it, they had to separate the male and female genetic lineages entirely. And that is where the real architecture of Neanderthal society and its hidden failure mode finally became visible. In genetics, there are two markers that scientists use to reconstruct lineage through a single parent. Mitochondrial DNA passes exclusively from mother to child and carries the signature of the maternal line through time. The Y chromosome passes exclusively from father to son and encodes the paternal history. By analyzing them independently, researchers can reconstruct the movement histories of men and women within a population as two completely separate threads, two records of who stayed and who moved, running in parallel through the same community. At Chagyrskaya, those two threads told stories that could not have been more different from each other. The Y chromosome data, the paternal signal, showed exactly what you would expect from a small, geographically fixed, demographically closed group. Limited diversity, consistent genetic signatures across generations. Males whose lineages had remained embedded in the same community for an extended period, reproducing within a restricted pool, passing that same restricted signal forward. The men of Chagyrskaya had stayed. Generation after generation, they had stayed. The mitochondrial data, the maternal signal, told the opposite story with equal clarity. The maternal lineages showed a pattern of diversity that was fundamentally inconsistent with the rest of the community's genome. The women were genetically distinct from each other in ways the men were not carrying mitochondrial signatures that diverged in directions that made no sense if those women had grown up in the same place as the men they lived. Alongside, this is not what internal reproduction looks like. This is what integration from external sources looks like. The females had not been born into this group. They had come from outside of it. And what that means for the larger system is something that, once you understand it, you cannot stop thinking about. The conclusion the researchers drew was direct. The females at Chagyrskaya were not local. They had originated in other population nodes and been integrated into this one. In the language of population genetics, this pattern is called female-biased dispersal. The females move, the males stay, and it is not unique to Neanderthals. It exists in certain modern human societies, in chimpanzees, in a range of social species where small group sizes create the conditions for inbreeding collapse if new genetic material is not introduced from outside. As a biological mechanism, it is almost elegant. You keep the males embedded in the group. They know the territory, the hunting routes, the seasonal patterns. You bring in females from outside, they introduce new genetic variation, reset the diversity buffer, prevent the compounding damage of generational inbreeding. The system sustains itself, in theory, but biological elegance is always contextual, and the context here is what transforms this finding from an interesting genetic pattern into something far more unsettling because the distances involved were not modest. This was not a female moving to the next valley over. With effective population sizes between 10 and 20 individuals, neighboring Neanderthal groups could not afford proximity. Too much overlap between groups that small, competing for scarce resources across a hostile Ice Age landscape, would have been unsustainable. The distances between viable population nodes were almost certainly vast hundreds of kilometers in many cases. One female found at Chagyrskaya carried a mitochondrial lineage, tracing back not to Siberia, but to a population from the Caucasus region, thousands of kilometers away. She was not an outlier. She was the system made visible. These women were not moving between neighboring communities. They were crossing between population nodes so far apart that, in that world, the journey was effectively one way. And that mobility system, the thing that had kept Neanderthal genetic networks viable across hundreds of thousands of years, was about to collide with a pressure it had never encountered before. At this point in the data, the extinction mathematics begin to become terrifying. It would be easy to look at Chagyrskaya and treat it as a local story. One cave, one community, one isolated Siberian population at the edge of the Neanderthal range. An outlier, a statistical footnote. But the evidence does not support that reading, not even close. The genetic signatures found at Chagyrskaya, the low diversity, the female bias dispersal, the effective population sizes hovering at the threshold of viability. These are not anomalies produced by geographic isolation at one extreme end of the species range. They reflect structural features of a population connectivity system that had been operating across the entire Neanderthal network for an extended period before the Chagyrskaya individuals were even born. This was not one struggling group in Siberia. This was the signature of a continental-scale demographic pressure system in an advanced state of deterioration. Across Europe, across Western Asia, across every landscape Neanderthals had occupied for 300,000 years, the architecture that had sustained them was running on progressively thinner margins. The mobility system that moved females between nodes required enough nodes to draw from. The genetic diversity buffer required enough intergroup connectivity to stay above collapse thresholds. Both of those requirements were eroding simultaneously. And then, modern humans arrived. Not as an army, not as a wave of conquest. As a competing network, a species whose own population connectivity system was faster, more flexible, and operating at a scale that Neanderthals, already fragmented into isolated pockets of 10 to 20 individuals, could not match. The Neanderthal women, who were already the most mobile members of their species, already the most experienced at crossing into unfamiliar groups and integrating into communities of strangers, they became the most likely points of contact with incoming modern humans. And what happened at those contact points, in whatever form it took, accelerated a process of reproductive bottleneck and population node collapse that was already running on its own momentum. At the continental scale, Neanderthal extinction may already have become mathematically irreversible before the last individuals alive had any way of knowing it. The Neanderthal genetic legacy did not disappear without a trace. The 2010 mapping of the Neanderthal genome confirmed what had previously been unthinkable. Roughly 2% of the genome of every non-African person alive today carries Neanderthal DNA. We did not simply replace them. At some point, across some encounters, we will never fully reconstruct. Our species and theirs exchanged genetic material, however asymmetrically, however partially. Their nuclear DNA fragments survived inside us. Their specific mitochondrial and Y chromosome lineages did not. They were filtered out across tens of thousands of years, leaving only scattered traces of a people who once held a continent. The interbreeding was real, but it was not an exchange between demographic equals. It was absorption, the integration of a fragmenting network into a more robust one, node by node, generation by generation, as the Neanderthal population connectivity system lost the redundancy required to sustain itself. And then, approximately 39,000 years ago, the Campanian ignimbrite eruption sent ash across 3 continents and descended a volcanic winter over the exact territories where the last significant Neanderthal population nodes were still operating. The largest volcanic event in Europe in 200,000 years. The eruption did not need to be an extinction-level event in isolation. When a system has already lost its redundancy, when your continental population consists of scattered groups of 10 to 20 individuals, already below the genetic diversity threshold for resilient recovery, already losing reproductive females to intergroup mobility and contact with incoming modern humans, a volcanic winter does not need to terminate the species directly. It only needs to remove the last remaining margin. The loss of a handful of reproductive females from a node that size is not a demographic setback. It is a mathematical termination event from which the network has no remaining pathway to recover. Neanderthal extinction was not an event. It was a system failure, slow, structural, compounding, and largely invisible until the endpoint had already become inevitable. No battle, no plague, no dramatic last stand. Just the quiet, relentless arithmetic of a survival architecture pushed past its recovery threshold with no pathway back. The mathematics are simple and brutal. Isolated population nodes of 10 to 20 individuals. A female mobility system bleeding reproductive capacity outward into communities of strangers across distances that made return impossible. Genetic diversity eroding below the redundancy threshold, intergroup connectivity collapsing at the continental scale, And finally, a volcanic winter to remove whatever margin remained. What is most disturbing is not the violence of the ending, because there was no great violence. It is the invisibility of it. A system losing, one by one, the properties that had made it viable. A species with no way of reading what that loss meant until there were no longer enough of them left to read anything at all. Because extinction does not begin when the last individual dies. It begins when the system loses the ability to recover. The most dangerous moment for any species, any civilization, any network built to endure under pressure is not the moment of visible collapse. It is the quiet moment before, when collapse has already become mathematically irreversible and nothing on the surface yet shows it. The Neanderthals reached that moment long before Gibraltar went silent. The women who crossed those impossible distances, who built lives among strangers far from wherever they were born, they were not victims of that failure. They were the mechanism the system used to delay it. And they were not enough. Not because they failed, because the margin they were protecting had already been reduced to zero. Their mitochondrial lineages are gone, but fragments of their DNA persist inside every non-African human alive today. Part of what we are was built from what they were. That is not a metaphor. That is molecular fact. The question this evidence leaves behind is not really about Neanderthals. It is about what happens when a system loses connectivity faster than it can compensate, when the mechanisms built to buffer against failure are still running perfectly, but the margin they are protecting no longer exists. That question does not belong only to the Pleistocene.